In this part of our tutorial, we're going to introduce a non-void return function. So up until now, we've seen a void function that with no parameters and a void function that has parameters. Now we're going to look at a non-void function with parameters. So we're going to do this by creating a couple of functions that return numbers. We'll have one function that returns an integer and one that returns a double. So we're going to use the example of a character moving about for the integer and a bank balance for the double. And we're going to perform some additions within these functions and return a result rather than printing them directly within the function. Now we've seen void functions with no parameters and void functions with parameters. Here we're going to create a function that does not have a void return type. So this is going to be a function that actually returns a variable. This time we'll be using numbers, and next time we can use strings, booleans, and characters. So what I mean by this is, you see all of these functions are void, and up until now we've only been using void functions, so not returning any kind of a variable. So when we call these functions, we don't need to store the result in a variable. They're not really returning anything. However, if we give the function a return type, then it will have to return a variable and we will have to store that. So what I mean is, if we create a function that's public, let's say instead of void, we're going to return an integer. Okay? And we'll call this function, let's see, what do we want to have this do? Let's have this function be called change position. So before, in previous videos, we've taken a look at, and what's the error here? We've taken a look, it's just giving me this error because I haven't assigned a return type. And that's fine, we'll do that in a little bit. So yes, in the integer videos, such as the integer variable videos and the integer arrays, we took a look at a list of commands, perhaps, that maybe a robot is taking in or a character in a game is executing. So let's do something similar here. Perhaps we have a list of commands and we're just going to return the final position. So let's have this function take in a few integers. So let's say int a, int b, and int c. Again, I'm not creating variables here. I'm just telling that the function to take in 3 integers. So we've only really passed in integers so far. We can pass in any variable if we want. We can pass in strings, we can pass in booleans, we can pass in whatever we want. But for our sakes and purposes, we're just going to pass in some integers. Okay? So what this is going to do is it's going to create another integer, and we're going to say this is a plus b plus c. Okay? And then we're going to return d. There we go, and see, we got rid of our error here, and that's because we included this return statement. So this is not so different from what we were doing before. We had some parameters that were integers, and we had a void return type. We were adding them and then just printing them out. This time we're not printing out anything within this function. All this is going to do is it's going to add in the 3 integers we passed to it, store it in another integer d, and then it's going to return that. And what I mean by return that is when the function is called, it's going to spit out a variable. And that variable is going to be of type integer, and it's going to be the result of this addition. So if we want to call this function, again we'll do it in view did load because we're in iOS. If I were to call this function, I could call change position, and let's say I want to pass in 1, 2, and 3. That's all good, but we're calling this function, but we're not storing the results in anything. So what we would have to do is we'd have to create another integer. Let's call this result, because that's what it is. And it's going to be the result of calling our change position on 1, 2, 3. Let's make this a little more interesting. Let's have forward 5, back 2, and then forward 3. So again, in our example of the list of movement commands, we had positive being steps forwards, negative being steps back. Okay? So all we're doing is we are calling change position on 5, negative 2, and 3 in our viewDidLoad. So once that's done, it's going to call our function and it's going to pass in 5 here, negative 2 here, and 3 here. It's going to add them together and store the results in D, and it's going to return D. And when I say return D, I mean it's going to store the results in this integer. And then if we want, we can print this out. So if we had text, it always also completes to that text, and then we said is result, and then we'll change that to string. Okay, and what's the error here? Oh, this is in iOS. This is actually a label. There we go. Cool stuff. So now we are going to call our function. We're going to pass it in these parameters, and we're going to store the results in here, and then we're going to print out the result. And basically, again, all this is doing is adding these movement commands. So we're going to update we're going to get an update on where this character's final position is. Okay, so let's just go ahead and run this now. So we'll run it with the iPhone 5S again, and just wait for it to build there. And here we go, we get 6 printed out, because we have 5 minus 2 would be 3, plus 3 would be 6. That's exactly right. So this right now is being passed real numbers. If we really want, we could have this passed variables instead. So let's say we want to create some integer variables. Let's say this is going to be int position 1. In fact, this is going to be movement 1, and we'll call it 4. And let's say we have int movement 2, we call it negative 2. And maybe we have a third int. In fact, let's leave the third int out. So we have these two movements. We can pass these in if we want, instead of passing in the real numbers. So let's say we want movement 1 and movement 2. And just to show you that we can have, it's a pretty dynamic environment, meaning we can pass in assigned variables, or we can just pass in numbers. I just want to show that. We'll run this again. The iPhone 5S. So again, it's just going to add these together, but we passed in some variables instead of real numbers. Okay, so we have a 4 is movement 1, so it's going to add 4, negative 2 is movement 2, and then 3, so basically we have 4 plus negative 2 plus 3, and that equals 5. So this is a basic function that has a return type. This one's going to be a return type integer. Now, just to solidify your understanding, we'll do a double function as well. So this one's going to be public double. And let's call this one update bank balance. Okay, this is going to be obviously to do with banking. And let's say we are making some kind of a transaction. So maybe there's a withdrawal or a deposit. And so in our bank account, we'll have the current balance, and then we'll have the balance. We want to return the balance after our transaction. So again, we have a current balance, and then some kind of a transaction, and then a final balance. So if we have this is going to be a double, it's going to be double current balance, and then we're going to have another double, and this is going to be the transaction. Okay, and again, we're getting this error because we haven't given it a return type yet. And so now we're going to create another double within here, and it's basically just going to be, we're going to call this final balance, and it's going to be the results of current balance plus transaction. Okay, so just something simple here. but with doubles instead of integers. And then we're going to return our final balance at the end. So this is doing very similar thing to change position, but with doubles now. And so yes, we're going to have the current balance start off with, we're going to have a transaction, and we're going to have the final balance. So let's call it in our viewDidLoad. So we'll get rid of this because we no longer want to call this function. And it's fine to do this. We have our function here, and if it's called, it's going to run this code. But if it's not called, this code doesn't run. So it's fine to create this function and leave it, as long as we're not calling it when we don't want to. Okay, so let's call it now. So we'll call update bank balance, and we'll pass in some parameters. So we can either pass in variables, we could create some variables that are, for example, double current balance equals $565, maybe an 87 cents or something. We can pass in current balance, and then maybe we have some kind of a transaction. I'm just going to put in a number here instead of creating another variable. So let's say this is negative $32.45. We make some kind of a purchase maybe. Cool, and once again, because we have a non-void return type, we're returning a double, we're going to have to store this in a variable. So let's have this stored in a variable which is a double, and let's call this final balance. So coming back to the idea of global versus local variables, notice I actually created the variable final balance twice. I created it once in the viewDidLoad function, and I created it once in the update bank balance function. Now this is fine to do, again, because these are local variables. You can't do this on a global scope or else you'll get errors. So because these are local variables, these are basically created when the function runs and then destroyed when the function no longer is running. So what's happening is once a function is called, it's going to create this variable, it's going to store the results, and it's going to return basically the results rather than that variable. And then it's going to store it in this variable which is created in this function. So again, just in case you're a little confused, it's fine to create the same variable within a function as long as it's a local variable and not a global one. Okay, and so now we want to print out final balance, and let's see this in action. Run with the iPhone 5S. So again, pretty much doing the same things we had before. These are just warnings because these variables aren't used, and that's fine. We don't have to use all the variables. And here we get our updated balance, $533.42, which is right because we have $565.87, and we're just subtracting $32.45 in our update bank balance. Then we're returning that and having it print out. So this is the way to create functions that are non-void return types. So we have an integer and a double. I think we'll skip the float because by now you should have a good understanding of how to create functions that return a variable and how to store that variable and then do something with it. In this part of our tutorial, we introduced a non-void return function. So up until this point, we've only really seen functions that return void, that basically don't have a return. This time, we saw a function that returned an integer and one that returned a double. So we created a function that updates a player's position and returns it, and that was with an integer. So basically, we added a couple of movement commands and then returned the final position, and had it print out in a separate area. And then we had a function that updates a bank balance and returns it in the form of a double. So we had two different numerical return types. So by now you should be able to create functions with void and non-void return types, call them, and store the results in a variable.